Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out to our event. Oh, perfect. Catherine just walked in the door. This event is to talk about our report, Faith and Development in Focus Philippines. So this event is co-sponsored by WFDD, the World Faiths Development Dialogue, the U.S. Philippine Society, as well as the Georgetown Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Asian Studies Program, and the Global Human Development Program. This report was a part of a four-country series sponsored by the International Program for Religion and Development out of Germany. And so what we really strive to do within these reports is to look at the development landscape, the religious landscape, and see how those two intersect. So we're very excited today to talk about our Philippines report. A little bit of an overview of the structure of today's discussion. Cameron Pulley, our consultant who did the field research and wrote the report, will talk about his process, his findings, etc. And then we will hear from the Consul General of the Embassy of the Philippines, Jose Victor Chan Gonzaga. And then lastly, Catherine Marshall will facilitate a Q&A at the end. So I hope you enjoy. Have a great day.
Catherine, do you want to say anything before I go?
Why don't you go ahead and
Okay.
sorry, I was teaching that class and it's so miserable outside.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to give a brief overview presentation on the methodology of the report, what the content of the report is. Yeah, so I'll just get started. Again, my name is Cameron Pulley. I worked on this project for about a year, from September of 2018 to September of 2019. Before I get started, I just wanted to make sure I, thanked. There's too many people to thank, but the staff at WFDD and the Berkeley Center, I was a principal author, but this was a team effort, and there would have been no way to get the final draft to the published status without their assistance. So Catherine, of course, Lauren Herzog, Wilma Mui, Ruth, who's in the back, she organized this event. Micah Musser and Louisa Banshoff, they were quite instrumental in editing the final report. Of course, our partners, GIZ, with the German Society for International Cooperation, the BMZ, German Federal Ministry for Cooperation and Development, and then PARD, and specifically from the Partners on Religion and Sustainable Development. And I particularly wanted to thank Ulrich Nitschke, who was the main liaison between between Catherine, myself, and our international partners. I was fortunate enough to be able to meet with GIZ representatives while I was in the Philippines, and I think that went a long way towards facilitating a cooperative and mutually beneficial partnership. On January 16th, we had our consultation, which here at the WFD office in DC, and I think that really represented the midpoint of the project. So we had all this preliminary research, and I wrote a concept note that was about 20 pages, and it was open for comment from experts in the DC area, and what aspects I was correctly focusing on, what aspects in what direction could the report grow. The primary research of the report, and the heart of the report, was really the field work, and I'm going to talk about all that later. So there was about 6 months of preliminary research and then 6 months of report drafting. The desk review, on one hand is you do your best you can with the literature review. You try to cast a wide net and you try to understand as much as you can. The Philippines is a very complicated case, especially in terms of religion. I'm going to talk about the demography a little bit later, but you have 81% of the population that's Catholic, and then no other group can necessarily claim more than 1% within one denomination. So this leads to a very complex but also involved religious landscape. So again, in terms of structuring the timeline, a lot of the early preparation was towards this this Washington-based consultation, where the concept note was open for comment, both in terms of what maybe I was focusing on too much on, or what direction I could take it, and that really set me, I think, up for success once I got to the Philippines, and it was a very dense period of field work, only about 5-6 weeks between February 11th and March 13th, and the entire day, 7 days a week, were scheduled with interviews. I had 3 to 4 interviews per day, formal structured interviews, but then on top of that, informal consultation. So all in all, there were 40 formal interviews and about 30 informal consultations, sometimes with multiple people in the room. The literature review provided the foundation. There was direction at the consultation. The primary research was done in the Philippines. I had to do a lot of further research once I returned from the Philippines because a lot of my previous perceptions were turned around, and a lot of aspects that I, had just not understood properly. I had to do a lot of research on that. So the drafting process was something that we took a lot of care on. So I think a lot of people may be wondering, what do you mean by structured interviews? What do you mean by informal consultations? What do these look like? So there's, of course, the scheduling aspect. How do you meet these people? How do you network? For the formal interviews, I always sent about 10 advanced questions, specifically about if it was a religious leader, what were their priorities, what was, how was their religious moralism playing into what they were focusing on. If it was a politician, which I had the fortunate opportunity to meet with, how were they forming partnerships across civil society and with religious institutions. It was quite interesting that nearly every public official that I talked to had already formed very strong partnerships with religious institutions on the ground, to the point where they were co-organizing government activities with religious institutions. The photo on the right is after my formal interview with the Archbishop of the Diocese of Cagayan de Oro. His name is Tony Ledesma. He's quite prominent, talking on the issues of extractive industries, environmental regulation, property rights, conflict. These are all major issues in Mindanao that were emphasized to me at every level of social development involvement. The picture on the left is after my formal interview with the former Chief Justice Sereno, who was recently, it's somewhat complicated issue, but she was basically forced out of her position without an impeachment trial. And that interview was quite enlightening for me for a variety of reasons, but one of them was the degree to which she emphasized why she was ruling on cases the way she was ruling, what was her foray into social involvement and social justice issues, and also what she wanted to do after she was forced out of the Chief Justice position. And I don't want to get too bogged down in details, but for that, many of these interviews consisted of a quite lengthy pre-discussion before we went on the record and recorded the interviews for what could be used in the report and in the primary research. a lot of that was building trust, but a lot of that was understanding how they saw themselves in the Philippine development context and also in the religious landscape. The Chief Justice actually, she said, well, if you can't cite Bible verse to me, then we should start with that. So we literally opened up Corinthians and started reading and then talking about how that applied to the issues that she was ruling on or the fact that she was pushed out of office. In terms of partnerships, she was emphasizing, now that I'm no longer going to be in a political position, my focus is going to be on how do I create partnerships within civil society. And she emphasized that starts with religious institutions. So the structure of the final report, how it ended up being, I wanted to start with history. I started with a timeline. It's quite long. It's about, but I didn't want to leave out the things that were the legacies that created the institutions that are observable today. The institutional growth, the activism, the development involvement we see, the relationship between religious institutions and wider Philippine society and politics, it did not happen overnight. I think the clearest example and the most preeminent example many people think of the Catholic Church's institutional involvement. It comments on law. It advocates for positions often. Where does that come from? I think when we were thinking about the intersection of religion and development, I had to start with the understanding that the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, which is the highest hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church in the Philippines, actually originated as a development organization strictly. After the Catholic Church was disentangled from the state with the American administration during World War II, and after the Japanese occupation, they re-entered the sociological context of the Philippines as the Catholic Welfare Organization to do wartime relief and social outreach. That remains the central principle that unites all of the Catholic dioceses in the Philippines and is part of the reason why they are so involved and so adamant that they will always stay involved in the development process in the Philippines. That had cascading effects across all of the different religious groups and communities in the Philippines and how they form their institutions. For example, in the Protestant community, we see cooperative ministries that have development programs. This is not something that is, like, for example, the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. There's an NCCP in the US, but it doesn't have a development arm, not like the Philippines. So understanding what makes the Philippines different in its religion and development intersection, why it's important, understanding the narratives, building that narrative in a cohesive way that is inclusive of history, and understanding how the modern social development context of the Philippines and the religious landscape is a major driver of both development action, but also collaboration across different things that people give importance to in society. So yes, we had three central aims. One is to improve awareness, just generally speaking, about the intersection of religion and development, provide an entry point into a quite complex literature. Also, the literature on intersection of religion and development in the Philippines is very much still dominated by Philippine academics, and I think that was a great thing for me to hear from the voices directly, and I was able to talk with those scholars once I arrived in the Philippines. But I think that something that was important for me to understand is how scholars over time were always emphasizing this. And then the last aim was to, how do we inspire collaboration? How do we use this report as a jumping off point? And originally, when I came into the project, I was considering this, okay, how do we inspire collaboration between the religious development community and the secular development community? But that was something that was really turned on its head once I did the field work in the Philippines, because it's not just about the religious line and the secular line. There's a lot to be done in inspiring collaboration between religious groups as well as inside religious groups, who oftentimes have very, very different positions on the same issues. So in approaching it, we had to emphasize context, process, and progress, always being forward-looking, but understanding how history informed us to get to the point that we were at. And in terms of faith-inspired organizations, I first had to consider, what do we really mean by a faith-inspired organization in the Philippines? Are we talking about religious organizations that are also doing preaching work? Are we talking about organizations that are focused on development work? Are we talking about organizations that are formally affiliated, informally affiliated? There's a whole dynamic of how much religion plays into why exactly you're involved in social development work. And this was really critical, I think, in the Philippines context. So I started with trying my best to understand what are the major institutions of development work within a religious community, and then how are they specializing within the development landscape. The Philippine government has the PDP, which is a quite well-developed development plan, which has, it's a quite long document, but it has three main aspects, I think: enhancing social fabric, reducing inequality, and increasing growth potential. This is from previous administration, but the Duterte administration essentially doubled down on the Philippine Development Plan with Ambition Natin 2040, which was an executive order, and it's mostly about poverty alleviation and the different aspects of how different development issues play into poverty alleviation, but it focuses on the family as the driving institution of development. And this is very critical because religious groups have historically been the most vocal groups on what the institution of the Filipino family means. And then I also talked about multilateral aid and bilateral aid in the diaspora community. By the way, the diaspora community and its remittances in the Philippines are among the most extensive in the world. 10% of the GDP of the Philippines is remittances from the diaspora community. So it's no small aspect of this system. So one of the biggest findings of the landscape and some of my initial perceptions that were turned on the head, I grew up partly in the Philippines, and the most prominent aspect of the religious community that I had always understood, partly because it's a major driver of education, is the Catholic Church. People, I think, misperceive that the Catholic Church in the Philippines is a monolith, partly because the CBCP is so vocal about what its doctrine is. It's very easy to find their position on nearly every social development issue or political issue in the country. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Catholic dioceses across the country are falling in line. Doesn't necessarily mean that the Catholic orders like the Jesuits, the Dominicans, they all have different priorities. They all have different specializations. If I could just for a moment, the Dominican order has really specialized as possibly the most vocal group on the issue of human trafficking. But that's really their focus. And in addressing Protestantism, understanding the Protestant church in the Philippines, it's extremely diverse, and much of it has a recent history with post the American administration, and it opened up after the Community Agreement and after the war that there was to be the lands of the Philippines would be divided between different Protestant churches. These dividing lines still hold true today, but it creates a system where no Protestant church is able to claim more than about 0.8% of the population, which creates a very chaotic dynamic where every Protestant group is identifying as Christian, but they have very different values. They're affiliated with very different organizations, and they have different development specializations. I categorized groups such as the Iglesia Ni Cristo and the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, the Aglapayan Church, Jesus is the Lord Worldwide, the Kingdom of Jesus Christ, these churches as Philippine restorationist churches. It has also been discussed in the literature as Philippinized Christianity. Basically, any group that formed in the Philippines is unaffiliated to any foreign church or co-ministry, and usually has Philippine-specific stories about divinity and things like that. The Iglesia Ni Cristo is, I should keep going, speed it up. The Iglesia Ni Cristo, potentially one of the most controversial aspects of the religious landscape in the Philippines, but also one that plays a major role. And I had the Iglesia Ni Cristo is very somewhat secretive and insular, but I did have the opportunity to speak to officials and attend a service while I was in the Philippines. Islam is also a major religious community in the Philippines, mostly in Western Mindanao and the Sulu Archipelago. In particular, with the establishment of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in 2019, overtly affiliated religious leaders have more of a say in what the regional development plan will be, but a lot of that is yet to be seen. So chapter 4, we talked about what I found to be the issue areas of development that most religious communities were focusing on. Disaster relief is probably the most visible one, because usually after a disaster there's just a massive influx of both supportive aid and faith-inspired organization activity. Partly this has to do with the fact that there's this concept of kapwa in the Philippines, which is sort of the fellowship of being Filipino. And this plays a lot into social development and organization. So if it would be determined that a particular religious community was not supporting typhoon relief efforts after Haiyan, then there would be a wave of criticism that would come to them, as was the case with the Felix Y. Manala Foundation after Typhoon Haiyan, which is the Iglesia Ni Cristo development arm. I talk about influence in private and public education, which takes many different forms. The most prominent institution in that is, of course, the Catholic Church. There are major health disparities between Muslim Mindanao and the rest of the country, both in terms of their access to basic health services and their health outcomes. It wasn't 100%. It's a difficult issue because on one hand, these areas are also suffering from conflict and poverty, which is partly responsible for some of these outcomes that we're seeing. But they also have comparably less support from the national government, which is part of the reason why many people in the Bangsamoro region are excited for greater regional autonomy with the BARM compared to the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. I want to skip ahead a little bit because I know I'm talking on, and I really want to open it up to discussion because I've been doing this for like a long time, but I want to talk to you guys. The most interesting issue to me of where there was real collaboration was on the human trafficking issue. It was really the only issue where I saw there was a joint statement put out by the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines and both of the highest level cooperative ministries in the Protestant churches, saying essentially we are in agreement that human trafficking is a major issue in the Philippines. We want to do something about it, and here's how we're going to coordinate our activities to do something about it. This was in 2018. I had never seen a statement so specific about how they were going to do what they were going to do and how they were going to do it together. So I think that's a cause for a lot of excitement and positivity moving forward. So looking forward, looking ahead, historical legacy was key. Understanding how these institutions grew and how they're important today, and also this concept of kapwa and this Filipino fellowship. Why is it that constituents of religious communities are demanding that their religious leaders be involved in development activities? It's a very active thing. It's very much, it plays a role during, like in the pulpit itself, where there will be discussions being had for, or in youth groups, for example. I had the fortunate opportunity to attend a Protestant youth group meeting, and the entire discussion was about how do we become more involved in our community? How do we pursue social outreach? And I think that was very fascinating. And that dialogue between religious groups, within religious groups, is almost always constructive in the Philippines. I think that sometimes because there is religious conflict in the Philippines, particularly around the issue of the MILF and the MNLF in Mindanao, many people see that or believe that there's just aversion between religious communities. And there was an interesting study in the literature review that tried to statistically model whether or not that actually was the case. The statistical correlation was very low, and in my experience when I was there, people are not actively disassociating because of religion. They want to work together. It's a matter of figuring out how do we do that in an effective manner. And that goes for aid organizations as well, the large multilaterals, bilaterals. A very important issue is how do we inspire collaboration between these organizations, the government, civil society, both in terms of secular civil society and religious civil society. And I am hopeful because the expanding of collaboration, begins between people. This, to me, was possibly the most interesting photo and moment of the trip. This has happened in Cagayan de Oro. On the left side is a civil society leader who works in the peace-building movement in northern Mindanao, particularly around the MPA issues, New People's Army. And on the right, or the left of me, is a city official. These two men were already co-programming peace-building activities and coordinating with the Archbishop in Cagayan de Oro. These weren't formally and declared partnerships, but they're partnerships that exist on the ground and are driving the activities. And that's something that took a lot of time and care to understand how it is exactly that these partnerships are built. But I am optimistic for the future, and yeah, I'd like to open it up to discussion and hear from our esteemed colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Cameron, for walking us through your report, which I honestly really found very interesting to read, and it's an easy read. So I encourage everyone to read the report from the first page to the last page. And I think it's very interesting also because there are a lot of things that I honestly did not know until I read the report, and I think there are a lot of insights about the demographics and the role that religion plays in the Philippines, and I think that the report fairly captures that. Let me start by thanking the Berkeley Center for having me, and thanking Professor Irvin Chongson of the Georgetown School of Foreign Service for linking me up with Berkeley Center, and thank you, Cameron, again for your presentation. And I just wanted to acknowledge also Hank. I think the U.S.-Philippine Society, who the embassy works with a lot, is also one of the co-sponsors or co-organizers of this event. Um, Let me begin with the classic denial that I'm not speaking officially for the government of the Philippines. But I think more importantly, I'm speaking as a Filipino. I'm speaking as a Catholic. I'm speaking as a Jesuit-trained lawyer, and as a diplomat also who's spent most of his career in trade and development. So I'm happy to share some thoughts about the report that Cameron described to us this afternoon. Um, uh, and then just one other thing also, Cameron referred to the timeline, which actually I think is really a chapter already in the report. It's a very interesting timeline in terms of how religious organizations and religions and Philippine reformist religions or Philippine reconstructionist religions have evolved through time and through the history of the Philippines from the colonial times into postmodern Philippines today. Let me begin by emphasizing, I think, some of the report's great observations and perhaps adding a word or two about them. One is that I think it seems to me uniquely Filipino that the depth, the breadth, and even the quality of the interconnection between religious and secular institutions are immense. And I think Cameron and the report captures that quite clearly. And in some ways, it's even unparalleled, I think, in the faith and development discourse or faith and development literature. So I begin with that. The second observation I think I wanted to highlight is that the cumulatively, and I'm quoting from the report now, the cumulatively quasi-state facility of religions and faith-inspired civil society organizations, end quote, is important to be mindful about. Whether we are a Philippine government official, whether we are an official for the ADB, or just an NGO trying to make a difference in the Philippines. Because I think this reality or this observation is important in helping us understand the dynamics in the Philippines, the dynamics in the development process and in the charity sector in the Philippines, and even I think, as I said, in policy making for governments, for multilateral financial institutions, and for other NGOs, as I said, trying to make a difference in the lives of Filipinos. The third observation, I think, is that, and this is the lawyer in me now talking, perhaps in no other Republican state in the world is the tension between the principle of separation between church and state and the actual realities on the ground more pronounced than in the Philippines. And I don't know, Hank has served in Manila. He probably might agree with that. And it manifests this tension in various ways in public debates and discourse. And I think I've always, as a lawyer, I've always found that fascinating. I've always found fascinating, just to give one example, a high government official declaring that there should be separation between church and state, but would have no qualms about having First Friday Mass being celebrated in a government office, for example. So I just wanted to highlight that, and particularly for lawyers or for those interested in constitutions, I think that's a very important tension that has to be recognized, and that forms part of the context, and we've emphasized context time and again in the report. The fourth observation is that the report notes the redundancies and the inefficiencies, the missed opportunities for collaboration, and the risks of counterproductive friction between actors, thereby resulting in less than optimal outcomes. I think it's basically just a microcosm of a broader and more global challenge for development work. For those of you who are very active in the development work, there's always this importance of ensuring coherence, ensuring coordination, ensuring that there is no redundancies or inefficiencies. And I think one of the more recent examples of that would be Typhoon Haiyan, where there was a lot of criticism, a lot of complaints about redundancies and inefficiencies because everyone was not talking to each other. So whether in the domestic setting, or I think multilateral financial institutions have also recognized this is an important reality to factor in as we think about how to help those in need. And just here, I think I wanted to cite a concrete example. our finance secretary, Secretary Dominguez, has been very active in urging, for example, the World Bank, the ADB, the IMF, and the International Finance Corporation to talk more to each other and perhaps to try to come up with one development plan for the Philippines. Because as it is now, and I think most of you are aware, each of these institutions would have their own development plans, sometimes with varying duration in terms of how many years they're talking about. And the last observation I think I wanted to highlight really is the improvement of transparency and accountability, which is going to be crucial for the long-term viability of these faith-inspired organizations and the important work they are doing, because it goes to the core of their credibility, both to governments, to multilateral financial institutions, and to the people they serve, and to the people who actually support the work that they do. So this will affect the trajectory, in my mind, and the quality of future intersections, either with secular, national, or international organizations, as well as with other faith-inspired organizations working on issues of mutual interests. So those are, I think, some of the 5, as I said, really important observations from the report that I encourage you to read in full. And I'll leave them at that, and then we can go back to them in the Q&A later on. The other thing I wanted to focus in terms of my remarks here are basically 2 comments. One comment on the Catholic Church and one comment on the broader issue of Filipino tradition. The Catholic Church, as Cameron mentioned to us, is about 81% of all Filipinos. And I think the role that the Catholic Church has in Philippine life, whether it's in politics, in the economy, in development, in social issues, in human rights, looms large in domestic politics and development policy at the very least, when you're talking about the Philippines. But I think when we think of the Catholic Church, there are 2 things to remember. One is that often the church, and to a certain extent, I think many of the other religious players in the Philippines have stepped in to fill a void in Philippine life, in Philippine history. And the other thing I think I wanted to emphasize is that sometimes, if not often, personalities matter. On the first issue of filling in the void, I think if you look at the timeline, if you look at Philippine history, some of the important voids that the Catholic Church has filled was really in defense of Philippine freedom during the darkest years of our history when martial law prevailed over the Philippines. I think the report mentions that early on, the church tried to be neutral. The church tried to be focused really more just on the social and development issues. But really in 1983, when Ninoy Aquino was assassinated, I think history teaches us that everything seemed to change, culminating in 1986 during the EDSA revolution. And then obviously the church playing a big role over the post-EDSA historical period, including in EDSA DOS in 2001 when Estrada was removed and President Arroyo was installed, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting because I think another void that it's now trying to fill together with others is this issue on human trafficking, which is a very important issue for the Philippines and really for the global community. It's also filled many voids in responding to the needs of the marginalized, especially as the report points out during disaster season, during times of disaster. It's been there to step up whenever there is a void that needs to be filled. The second thing I think to remember is that in a way personalities matter greatly, and in some ways I think it matters more greatly in a country like the Philippines than in many other countries for that matter. So these personalities have contributed to the ebb and the flow of the influence of many of these groups. I think a classic example would be Jaime Cardinal Sin of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines. Cardinal Tagle is fairly popular now, especially now with him taking on a bigger role in the Vatican. But I think no one has really filled in recent history the shoes that Jaime Cardinal Sin, left behind when he passed away. But I think also it's also a function of the historical evolution of things. Things have changed, and the demands on having someone from the CBCP perhaps being more politically active is no longer as great as it was in the post Ninoy Aquino assassination period. Interesting personalities also would be Manalo, the founder of the Iglesia Ni Cristo. Again, the question: has those shoes been filled by the current administration? Mike Velarde of El Shaddai and Eddie Villanueva of Jesus is Lord are two personalities also. Again, the question would be: what will happen to El Shaddai? What would happen to Jesus is Lord once these two pass from the scene or from the public stage? I think those are important because many of these latter organizations are really more personality based, I think, than the Catholic Church or the archdioceses or the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines. So in sum, I think what's important to remember when we think of the Catholic Church and the role it's played in our history and the role it's played in domestic politics and domestic policies is that things are also changing within the Catholic Church. I think younger churchgoers are now less likely to take, to use the phrase, hook, line, and sinker what comes out of the pulpit. Younger churchgoers are thinking now more independently than when our parents used to sit there, look at the priest, and basically take ex cathedra what comes down from the pulpit. So I think in some ways or others, it's no longer top down when it comes to the Catholic Church. There's more engagement, there's more involvement now among the congregation. The final thing that I wanted to make about as a general comment is the issue of Filipino tradition. Cameron asked that he attended these meetings and there was this question: why is there a demand to be involved in development, in social outreach? The report alludes to the Filipino ethos of helping others or the concept of kapwa or fellow being. I think I'm happy it's in the report, but it's probably not as examined as we probably should examine it. But I think that particular concept and many others in Filipino tradition might merit further consideration and examination, because it might not be completely relevant in terms of the discussion on faith and development and mapping it, but it could explain and illuminate further our understanding of the dynamics of support for faith-inspired organizations. Why do I say this? Many of you might be familiar with Raul Manglapos. He wrote a book entitled Will of the People, and he argued for the concept of original democracy in non-Western states. And in arguing for that concept of original democracy, he speaks about a fundamental faith. And it's a fundamental faith rooted in and I'm quoting him, a native love for freedom and equality. So the point is, in the end, what we seem to be ascribing to Catholicism or to Islam or to other religions or belief might really just be institutionalized manifestations of the Filipinos' indigenous and the inherent, and to use the words of Manglapos, native love for humanity, for the kapwa, for the fellow being. So, in the end, maybe it's not faith-inspired, it's maybe just the Filipinos' innate, indigenous, non-colonially handed down love for the fellow being, for the kapwa. I'll end with a sort of a question, I think, or for Cameron to respond to. I'm not sure it gave me pause, but it certainly struck me, the first action point recommended at the end of the report. I agree that we should recognize as these organizations, these FIOs, as fundamental forces in development. I agree that we should include them in due diligence, particularly if you're a foreign government or a multilateral financial institution trying to help. But I would just say that open recognition and formal engagement are fine lines to tread. And I think we just have to be very careful about making sure that this does not complicate things. This does not complicate the relationship between those two people, for example, in one of those last photos that Cameron had in his presentation. So again, thank you, Catherine, for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion we'll have. Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much, and I'm, what am I supposed to do? It's on now? Okay. Apologize for being late. I was teaching a class, and it took a little longer to get here than I expected. Thank you both very much for these very enriching discussions that I think are very provocative, that open it up. A couple of very quick comments. For those of you who are not familiar with the work that we're doing at the Berkeley Center on religion and development, this was born in a very unlikely place, which was the World Bank. Where the president, Jim Wolfenson at the time, was very struck by how little the institution knew about what was happening in this complex world of religion, which kept hitting him in different ways. So in 1998, he started a dialogue process. That's why the World Faiths Development Dialogue, which has been followed, particularly following 9/11. By a number of other development institutions in different ways. But we've pursued that in the Berkeley Center, both at a global level, looking at global issues like trafficking and others, but also we concluded that until you got to the country level and really focused on how institutions and beliefs intersected with others, it was very difficult to get beyond platitudes and generalities in saying that these issues were important. So we do start with three questions, which is, what's religion got to do with development? Secondly, why does it matter? How much does it matter? How does it matter? And then third, what does that mean in policy terms, which in many ways is the most difficult issue in which you both have focused on. So that has led us to about 10 countries where we have essentially looked at them asking what can we learn and what can our colleagues, both in the religious and the development communities, learn from these explorations. And they are very much exploratory, which is why we heartily welcome your views and your inputs. So why the Philippines? It was partly because the German government, which was the primary funder, was particularly interested in work in the Mindanao area. That was the original impetus. It was also that examples from the Philippines kept popping up in these global discussions. And so we embarked on the Philippines with at least some awareness of how complicated it was, but I think not a full awareness of quite what was what was involved. And I think one of the points which you both have emphasized is how much there is to learn on a variety of issues that range from freedom of religion and belief and the way that applies, the ways in which the institutional structures contribute and don't contribute to partnerships. But I would emphasize there were a couple of issues that, and even I was at a meeting earlier this week in Bangkok on freedom of religion and peace building in Asia. And one of the challenges is that the worlds of peace building, which was what started the German government and PARD, the Partnership for Religion and Sustainable Development, on this exploration. The worlds of peace building and the worlds of development are remarkably fragmented and separated at this point. And the Philippines is a fascinating case study, as it is in the question of disaster relief and disaster response, as we're even now seeing with the global health crisis. And how do we draw on the knowledge of different institutions, including those that come from this very large and complex world of religion. So I think the focus for us here and now is on what do we learn and where do we go from here, both in the Philippines, where I think one of the comments Cameron came back from his field work with was that people felt that this was very timely, that there are a lot of very immediate issues that are raised in different ways through this exploration. And what does it imply for the research program overall? Final comment is that this clearly started as trying to fill what has been a huge knowledge void in the development business, which is the work of institutions and people who start with a religious inspiration. It really is a blank slate. I cite often and still, I think it's still true. I haven't checked in the last couple of years, but the World Bank has no category in the library for religion. It simply was not part of the discussion. You do word searches of documents on education, on health, on others, and you don't find any systematic approach to these issues. So clearly there is a great deal to learn, and learning in some sense is sort of the first objective. But the second thing that I think has been interesting is that the explorations of this intersection of these worlds has also prompted us, forced us sometimes, to reflect much more on what we mean by development. And what are the practical definitions and understandings? What are the disagreements? What are the ethical issues that are raised in thinking about the kinds of broad-based changes, the human rights issues, the equity issues that come, that are implicit in the way we think about development issues, and which in many ways become more direct and more explicit as we get into the world of looking at these very complex institutions that contribute in so many different ways. So let's open it up. We have a half hour. Please tell us who you are, and I'm going to have the classic thing. If we could try for questions as opposed to speeches, it would be helpful. There is a microphone. Well, I don't think if you told people that this is recorded. And so that's one reason why we're fussy about microphones. And it will be on the website eventually.
Augustus Alzona, former senior foreign policy advisor, Trump for President campaign 2016. Filipino by birth, American by choice. My question is this, concerning the church in the Philippines, and just Christianity over there in general, but specifically the church. Is the church in the Philippines undergoing the same struggle or controversies with, for lack of a better term, probably the extremist homosexual agenda, including gay marriage and LGBTQ rights, whatever? Is that going on in the Philippines? And what do you think the chances are that same-sex marriage would become law in the Philippines within the next few years or decades?
Which of you would like to?
I can start.
Just in your personal and or professional opinion.
Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Well, let me first say I may not understand the question entirely. What I'll start with is that there is a section on LGBT issues in the report, which and the intersection of religion and LGBT issues is well developed, both in terms of the policy issues that the Catholic Church and other religious communities have taken on not just the issue of same-sex marriage, but the issues of, for example, hate crimes against the LGBT community in the Philippines, which is among the highest in Asia and in the top 5 in the world. So, uh, the if I'm understanding your question correctly, is twofold: whether or not um, first of all, whether I think that same-sex marriage may be legalized in the next 10 years or so, and the other question is whether that is, whether generally speaking that LGBT issue, well, su- supportive issues, positions that are supportive of the LGBT community are becoming part of the wider platform of the church. Am I understanding that correctly?
No, well, I'm just interested, I guess, in getting a feel for how the Philippine Catholic Church will be defending Christian marriage since the time of Jesus Christ.
Well, the Catholic
Without
Church,
being
the
being
cat.
to the Pope or something.
Well, I can't speak for the entire history of Christianity and its position on marriage and same-sex
Well, the Philippines
relationships.
Catholic Church.
Yeah, but the Philippines Catholic Church has been very clear. Every time a marriage bill that includes LGBT protections is brought forth, it has made a clear statement non-supporting the issue. And I do think that that will continue in the foreseeable future, but we will have to wait and see. That's all I can say.
Comment?
Uh, I don't wanna as like Cameron, I don't think I wanna comment on exactly how it's gonna play out because it I guess the jury is out really now on how influential is the church still with the Philippines. As Cameron said, I think there's no debate among the many of the mainstream traditional religious organizations like the Catholic Church. Their positions are clear. So I just wanted to share some developments, and I leave it to you to make your own conclusions. I think the debate is really now more in the on the government side, on the legislative side. So just on the issues that you referred to, Guz, well, one, under Article 36 of the Family Code of the Philippines, it's a 1987 executive order from President Cory Aquino. There is already a de facto divorce in the Philippines. It's called psychological nullity of a marriage because of psychological incapacity of either or both parties. And well, rightly or wrongly, that's been used over the years to end marriages as if there was divorce in the Philippines. The Supreme Court at one point tried to rein it in, but then there's been all of these jurisprudence over the years. Reproductive health, it started with an executive order from President Duterte, but that's also been passed already. The Republic Health Bill has been also been passed already by Congress. Just 2 days ago, I think the lower house of Congress approved the divorce bill, so that now the fight now goes to the Senate. So all of these developments have been happening, and lastly, same-sex marriage that went to the Supreme Court. The family code seems to be very clear. Marriage is a union between man and woman, but that case went to the Supreme Court, challenged on almost the same grounds. It was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court for violating equal protection of the laws. It lost. It was dismissed on a technicality, so it's a big question mark whether the justices are, once that technicality is resolved, whether the justices are inclined to find the same way that the U.S. Supreme Court found that prohibiting same-sex marriage violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution.
But if I could just add one last thing. While the religious community, particularly the Catholic community, is very clear in terms of doctrine on the issue of same-sex marriage, more recent studies, particularly one done by the Pew Research Center in 2019, cited that in a poll, 75% of Filipinos were supportive of same-sex marriage. So the jury is not out on whether or not, it's clear what the Catholic Church's position is. It's not so clear what the people want to do about it, whether their faith is so prominent in how they view policy that they would also support the continued blocking of same-sex marriage. But I do think the jury is not out on either side.
So few is big deal.
Can we, I mean, I'm doing the best I can with the research resources I have.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Olivia Wilkinson from the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith in Local Communities. Thank you to both speakers, and thank you, Cameron. I can see so much work has gone into this, even just the timeline, for example. There's so much there. It's very good. I have two questions and then a very quick point. The question around my PhD was on Typhoon Haiyan and secular and religious engagement in the response. So that's kind of my specific interest area. But I wondered if you could say a little bit more about national civil society, national NGOs working in disaster response and broadly development work, specifically, for example, the social action centres committees at the level of dioceses. That's where I think, we've got a really good list and a quite comprehensive list of like the World Vision's Islamic reliefs of the world. But I wondered if you could say any more on the, nationally, locally faith-inspired organisations doing some of that work that you make reference to at other points. The other area, you specifically mentioned human trafficking. I wondered how much came up on climate. In my research, I saw that a lot of, the idea of stewardship, the inspiration from Laudato Si came forward as a really big inspiration for faith-based work in development around climate change adaptation, mitigation to the risks from climate hazards. And then just finally, I think the point about how we define secularism in this report merits a little bit of a further conversation. There's secularism that's very specific to the Philippines that we were hearing about, and then there's the secularism of the international humanitarian organizations, which come from their own specific country, way of thinking through secularism. So there's quite a little bit of a difference between asking secular development organizations and to improve their religious engagement versus how the secularism of the way that that's constituted in the Philippines might engage with the different, how that exists with different faith-based organizations. That's it.
So I'll and feel free to jump in at any point. So I'll address the first question about Typhoon Haiyan first. I think that what we saw in Typhoon Haiyan was, and these are my perceptions based on the research, is that there was a massive influx of both aid and new organizations that wanted to participate in the disaster relief process immediately, not necessarily organizations that were staying several years down the line for real rehabilitation efforts. In terms of the question was partly specifically about how more local level organizations and regional level, like the diocese, were acting differently potentially than the large international faith-inspired organizations. So one thing that was definitely observed was that the Catholic dioceses were making statements about the wider regional impact, but in terms of their work on the ground, it was strictly within their own diocese, and there was very little partnership between dioceses, even in dioceses that were very, very small and potentially dividing between one city. I think that may have been mostly expected because it has to do with where their capacity is, where their volunteers know where to act in such a chaotic situation, something that was happening very fast. What is potentially more under the radar but also very interesting is I did see, particularly in the high-end efforts of the Iglesia Ni Cristo and the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, the Aglapayan Church, as well as independent Protestant churches, they were only providing relief efforts within their own parishes. Now, these parishes might, what is the parish actually look like on the ground? It could be very much Swiss cheese. So because they were limiting their efforts to specific constituents of their parishes, they were limiting who was directly receiving, for example, food aid, who was able to stay in the church when their homes were destroyed. These were direct decisions that were being made that left some people homeless for a longer time, even if there was, or hungry for a longer time, even if there was available resources to support them.
I think that's true in some cases, not all cases.
Yeah, this was particularly observed in southern Visayas and in northern Mindanao when Typhoon Haiyan. I'm not speaking for the entire.
Because of the Protestant churches that were doing very good work for that whole community, so it's not to underestimate that.
Right. I'm actually more talking about like the smaller churches, especially ones that are not affiliated to the Philippine Council for Evangelical Churches and ones that are not affiliated to the National Council of Churches in the Philippines. So these are because those cooperative ministries had plans and statements put out within a week after Haiyan hit. So it is difficult to negotiate, and I'm sure since you did your PhD thesis on it, you know more about it than me. But yeah, I think it was a very much a relevant narrative as part of the Haiyan history, and also understanding how disaster relief and rehabilitation works now. So the second question was about sort of co-organization and collaboration around climate adaptation. It's hard to say. For me, it's hard to say, and you can feel free to jump in. I think that a lot of the narrative around climate change and climate adaptation in the Philippines has been taking place through the disaster relief lens, through the disaster rehabilitation lens, because the Philippines is observing that it is among the most vulnerable nations to climate change, to sea level rise, to more extreme typhoons. And so usually, in my opinion, in terms of action, orientation of action, it's most observed during these crises. Would you like to jump in on anything? There was a third question on
Secularism.
Would you mind repeating that question?
I didn't really phrase it very well as a question, so it was just
It was just a comment on, secularism is not a monolith. It doesn't exist. It has its local contextual ways of expressing itself. So it mainly came to mind because you were mentioning that final point of the action points at the end of the report about the different public secularism amongst development agencies and the government. And I'm just saying it can be very, very different. So there's just a little bit more of a nuance in that action point around the different recommendations for different types of organizations.
I'm sorry that Jose Casanova left just before you asked the question, because that's his specialty, is focusing on secularism, which I think is actually one of the most difficult words in our lexicon, is figuring out, because as you point out, what people mean by secular can either be a very bad word, meaning amoral or immoral, or completely lacking any spiritual content, to much more specific understandings of the issue that you so rightly raised, of the very interesting Filipino examples of separation of church and state and what that actually means. What does freedom of religion actually mean in practice? And how does it relate to the development agenda, which is not something that has been very much debated or articulated in the past.
Yeah. So I thank you for clarifying, and I agree with your point, and I think it's partially like a lot of the way that I approached researching this project, and my understanding of the Philippine context comes out of the Filipino literature, like the academic literature that's originating from the Philippines. So a lot of the definitions that are used of secularism or other terms in the piece are specifically within that literature. And I think, right, would do better to clarify some of those.
We have other questions? Here. And then next. You.
Hi, I'm Elise Anderson, a student at the School of Foreign Service. I had a question on the Filipino context and coming together for a common understanding of what religious pluralism and religious freedom means, and whether initiatives by faith communities in that realm also help coming together to work on issues like anti-human trafficking and other items of like other problems.
So to start off with the human trafficking issue, look at what I was observing on the ground is that there's collaboration happening between religious groups, between denominations in a very real way on the ground, but it's not always so public. With the human trafficking issue, in 2018, with this joint declaration from the CBCP, the PCEC, Philippine Council of Evangelical Churches, and the NCCP, for the first time there was a joint declaration that both included that these groups, which essentially would represent, if you're going by the doctrine, maybe close to 90% of the population, 85% of the population at least, in terms of what their religious affiliation is. For them to say that this is an issue that we are in agreement and here's what we're going to do about it, I hadn't really seen that so public, I hadn't seen it so public before. And the question was raised about, okay, well, is climate adaptation another one of these areas where we see agreement? I think yes, it is one of, in disaster relief, we see clear agreement. We don't see coordinated, collaborative action necessarily. And I think human trafficking is the first time, at least in my review of the literature, that it was so public, so clear, and they wanted a citable resource to hold themselves accountable to it.
Thank you. Maybe just to add, my firsthand knowledge is a little bit dated now, but just recalling from my past experiences when I was in Manila and in a past job, for example, I think consultations in the Philippines are on a whole range of issues. So that would include climate change, that would include human trafficking, etc., are very inclusive. And many of the archbishops, if it's a local issue, are always important resource persons. So I think in that way, there is that avenue, there's that opportunity for religious organizations to be engaged. Now the question is, how coordinated are they, or how active are they? I think would be a case-to-case matter, depending on the issue, depending on the locality, etc., etc. But certainly, and I hope that Cameron saw this during his field work, that consultations in the Philippines are very inclusive, regardless of the topic or regardless of how sensitive the topic is.
That was definitely my observation, by the way. People are always open to the consultations and also very open to speak their mind during those consultations.
Sunny Busa of the Philippine Veterans Recognition Project. Now, talking about the interface between religion and development. Now, if I were a contractor or a developer and I submitted a contract to do something or build something, would I have to couch that contract in religious terms, or how would that affect me winning a contract unless I inject some part of religiosity into it?
I thank you for that question, Sunny. I don't think that's necessary, and certainly, I mean, no, I don't think that's necessary, and certainly, I would encourage anyone from bidding for a government contract, couching it in religious or even humanitarian terms. You can do that, I guess, in your press releases or anything, but all bids or proposed financial proposals will have to be on their economic and financial viability.
Maybe just to clarify that in a broader sense, the approach that we take in the Berkeley Center and the World Faiths Development dialogue, is that the purpose is to understand what is happening in again, to come back to the Pew figures, that what sort of 84% of the world's population has some religious affiliation, that it makes very little sense to be talking about broad social, economic policy issues with ignorance of what that world, what the institutions are involved in, what the beliefs are, how they influence behavior, how they influence advocacy for policy. What that does not mean, clearly, is that there is a religious position that is being advocated. We're talking about knowledge and understanding and sensitivity, not about some particular religious lens. I was trying to imagine what a contract would look like that had religious language. I can actually imagine some countries where that might be significant, but not the Philippines.
Thank you. It's Hank Hendrickson of the U.S. Philippine Society. Thank you, Cameron and Catherine, for presenting this and for the report. Congratulations, and JV for your really interesting and informed response. My question centers on trying to get an impression from you through the research on the issue of how to deal with intercommunal violence in the sense that violence reduction and promotion of security is really a precondition, particularly in areas in the southern Philippines, for development and progress on development. There's always this debate, and we've seen it in other countries of the world, which comes first. It's a chicken and egg thing. The security boys say we can't do any work here unless the young men get jobs and you have development. In my experience in government, the USAID people would say, we can't do our projects here, they keep getting blown up, and that kind of thing. It's very simple. But at a different, that is background. But in the Philippines, I think you see this issue and the real demands. You mentioned the importance of progress and strengthening institutions for regional autonomy under the BARM. There was a group here sponsored as an educational exchange group here just in January of mayors and officials from both Zamboanga and Davao. They met with a group that was a faith-based group in Montgomery County, Maryland, that works on community relations among the faiths and to address problems of stresses and anti-Semitism, prejudices against different groups. So this group from the Philippines was looking at takeaways, examples of what might work here so they could take it back. And actually it was the mayor of Davao who said, in our promotion of dialogue among the faiths, the dialogue tends to be among the religious leaders of the Christian religion and some of the others, but particularly the Islamic and Christian leaders among the clergy. Whereas in the Montgomery County example, much bigger role for individuals, members of the churches. And I wonder if you found that there's room for moving in that direction in the Philippines, or if that squares, particularly Cameron, with your sense of the state of the dialogue, and then if not, what can be done to help promote a broader and more broadly based dialogue to deal with the problems in Mindanao. Thank you.
So to start off with, I think that my observation, at least 2019 especially, was possibly one of the tensest times between different religious communities in Mindanao, which are overlapping, and they're not separated by regions necessarily. They live amongst each other in the same communities. On one hand, there was a lot of tension ahead of the plebiscites for the BARM. People fearing, okay, well, we were once the majority in our state. If we become the minority, will our rights be defended? How will our rights be defended in the regional, the BARM's forthcoming constitutional documents, how we would be represented in their regional government. So there was a lot of fear around that, and fear of the escalation of violence after the establishment of the bomb. At least this was what I observed was the talk. And but actually, simultaneously, something very encouraging happened, and I think it goes to something that you were talking about. It's like earlier we saw discussions maybe more limited to the religious leaders and how they were feeling about these issues and the doctrines that they would put forth to their constituents. But when it was ahead of the plebiscite, especially in the lead up to, there was a lot of tension, there was a lot of fear, and actually I think that it inspired people more to talk with each other and represent their own views. And there were a lot of like town hall type events and events that were organized by different local level community religious leaders, where they moderated it was quite striking to me, where they moderated the discussion, but like there would be a room of people and they would be able to chime in, and they felt like they could more easily and safely represent their position with their respective religious leaders there, but in the same room with one another. And I do think that is cause for great encouragement, and I hope that as there's a lot to be seen with how the barn will function, but I do hope that spirit of actually communicating with one another becomes something that becomes part of the discussion DNA of how policy is conducted in the barn.
Can I just share something? I just remembered it suddenly. There was someone who asked a question about peace building and development, and then Hank's comments and question also. For those of you old enough to remember, during Fidel Ramos's time as president, he had this National Unification Commission. Essentially, the premise of the establishment of the commission was that you needed peace in order to have development, which Hank was alluding to, and this commission really laid the groundwork for all the peace processes and the peace panels that we have today. And this was in the late 1990s, and perhaps this is because he was the first and until now the only Protestant president in a predominantly Catholic country. That commission was heavily consulting with religious organizations. I think the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines and the National Council for Churches in the Philippines, which are the Catholic and the Protestant big councils, were, I'm not sure whether they were represented in the commission or they were heavily consulted by the commission, but they certainly were playing very influential roles in terms of advising the commission on the peace processes at that time. So I think that's a very good historical example of that intersection between secular organizations and religious organizations in the context of peace building and development.
Just as a general comment, there's been an enormous amount of work in the Philippines, probably more than any place that I know in terms of peace building labeled as such. I think CRS Catholic Relief Services has been working at least for 20 years. It's an interesting question to how that's evaluated and what the impact has been. And it clearly has had women's groups and youth groups. But looking back, this is not in the context of this study, but a few years ago, there was a meeting under the auspices of the Social Science Research Council, which was looking at the issue of development versus peace building, and it focused on the Philippines. And it was quite dramatic how separate, how siloed these worlds were and what their images were of each other. That the development community tended to be quite skeptical about peace building and workshops and so forth. But the peace building community was very skeptical about the development community, that all they cared about was money. They never left the capital city. They really didn't have any understanding of the complexities at the community level. So I was left from that with an agenda, which is the need to try to work to bridge these communities much more effectively. And I think the Philippines is a good place to start or to continue the effort. I think we're almost at the end. We'll have one more question.
Hi. Wow. Hi, Chris, just a resident in DC. I really appreciated the discussion of, this idea of kapwa and communities coming together, and also just the faith community and faith leaders. And I think something that was mentioned earlier is this, I think with both religious and non-religious organizations or institutions, like, being able to step in, in a role in the Philippines in terms of, filling a void. And I guess my question was focused around, like, what is like this need to fill the void? Where does it come from? What are the social impacts of, the faith community and faith institutions, like, coming in to fill a void? What are like the roots of that? Any sense?
I can try to start. It was something that I definitely struggled with, especially at the beginning, because even growing up as a child in the Philippines, I looked around me and I saw all these organizations and people talking about faith and why it was they were becoming involved in the community. It was quite difficult for me to understand, and then I started writing this report, and I'm like, it's still difficult for me to understand why exactly they are so intent on doing and serving their community in the way that they are. And that's why I really took, I think there was some struggle with it, especially in the literature review phase of like, how do I actually talk about this thing that is sort of unspoken, but also like a reality? And I settled on, having a real commitment to understanding the historical legacy, how these institutions grew, why it was that they adopted the issues they did at the time that they adopted them. And as you go through the report in greater detail, there's pretty much a paragraph at the head of every single religious community about their historical foundation and how that converted into the foundation of their institutional development arms or charity arms. And I wrote all that, and I was like, there's still something missing. And that's when I was like, well, I have this kapwa is very, very important. This concept, it's even hard to define. I consider like the fellowship of being Filipino, and it's really at the heart of all of this. Even if the church has had 1,000 years of supporting communities, 1,000 years of social outreach efforts, why is it that it's taking certain forms in an iterative way in the Philippines? It's a uniquely Filipino concept, and I think that the best we can do is just recognize it as a uniquely Filipino concept.
I completely agree. Yeah, obviously there are certain cases where someone's pushed by history into it. To a certain extent, Cardinal Sin, for example, I think was primarily pushed into history, but as Cameron pointed out, it's really that.
But Cardinal Sin, he didn't necessarily have to do it. He still chose to do it, and Cardinal Sin also made a statement during EDSA 2, but the Catholic Church refused to support parties that were trying to call for the ousting of Arroyo during the Hello Garcia scandal in 2005. So it's not just the Catholic Church wants to remain a political hegemony. It's not just that they want to have their influence stay in Filipino politics. They're choosing when to become involved, and they're considering it in a moral sense, I think. I think that's quite important in the Filipino context.
That's a very good set of topics to end on, and including the focus on personalities and history. and the way they work together. It's quite interesting that in some of the sort of reactions to the work that we do in trying to put more light onto what religiously linked organizations are doing, one response is that they're filling in for failures of the state. That's certainly one interpretation. I think that there are obviously cases, DRC comes to mind, and some others where that is the explanation of how groups have mobilized. But there is something much broader that relates to the issues of civil society roles and how communities respond and the respective responsibilities of the state and of communities. Well, I want to end by thanking all of you for coming. I hope that we'll continue this discussion. This is really just a beginning. And thank you very much to both of our excellent presenters for, I think, very thought-provoking comments and very thoughtful insights into what is, in our view, a very special and fascinating case study. So, and thank you, Erwin, also. I need to give a special thanks to you for your role in helping to make this possible.